marine park being established in Queensland. I just wanted to know what your take on the mining at Coral Reef is in Western Australia. Do you think that's just because there's less people in Western Australia to protest something like that going on over there? Because there's a lot of people in Queensland who stopped mining on the reef, and I think that was the best thing ever. And yeah, it's not the 60s anymore, and it's Western Australia. So yeah, what's your opinion?
Gary.
Thank you for that question. I'll probably give a very diplomatic answer, I guess. There's a fair degree of very, very close monitoring of what's going on those reefs by some people probably in this room from the Australian Institute of Marine Science. If you want my personal feeling, I feel it's a fraction dangerous for the same old reasons, but there'll be people in Australia with a very different opinion. You've got to remember back to coming back on the East Coast what things were like, because I'm old enough to remember that campaign in the late 60s and early 70s, believe it or not. And there was a great deal of threat at the time, as I just indicated. And it took a lot of very, very brave people to turn that round. I don't know if you noticed that Save the Reef thing. That was the first bumper sticker in Australia was Save the Reef. I had one on my old Beetle VW when I was a student.
And what were the emissions from that thing? You're part of the problem, man.
Actually, back in those days, I found out at the meeting that the parts per million of CO2 was only about 325 back in 1969. I worked it out at the meeting this week. But no, it's something that's... It's going to be very varying opinions. All I will say about the Western Australian case is that those situations are being really closely monitored, and it will be interesting to see what the outcome of that is.
Right. So we've got your bookmark up here. We'll find a better way of delivering it than me strong-arming it down to the back of the room. A question for Jenny over here. Now, just to point out, if we don't get more questions from the floor, I will be asking questions. Thank you. And the chances of you getting the bottle of wine when I'm the other contestant are not great. Okay? Got a little bit of a problem. Yeah.
This is to any of the panel. You talked a lot about the people who've done good things, and a lot of the people in this room have made a big impact on getting the Great Barrier Reef rezoned. So the heroes of the past, Judith Wright et al. It's interesting that nobody ever talks about the people who deliberately went out of their way to thwart the rezoning of the Great Barrier Reef. And I know that Terry and I were both consulted by David Kemp within a week of the Cabinet meeting, and it was touch and go. Is there any merit in ever naming the names of the people who tried to stop things like the rezoning of the Great Barrier Reef and other things?
Yes. I thought I had your name on the door as not to be allowed in, Hugh Possingham. Should be out there doing push-ups. Yeah.
Thank you, Hugh. I don't know how to answer that. I think there was a lot of very vocal and public opposition from a fairly small minority. So, as you know, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, Gabrumpa, set a new benchmark in public engagement and, to some extent, public education, and the science community lent a hand in that. They had, I think, something like 31,000 written submissions as part of the process for rezoning the reef. They also undertook regular public opinion polls, which were sort of semi-secret. But the results of that were unequivocal. So there was incredible public support for the rezoning of the reef, which became effective in 2004. So to some extent, it was a rerun of the earlier campaign that created the marine park in the first place. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
That's all we've got time for. We do have time for 2, maybe 3 more questions. So get those hands up in the air. Yeah?
The
climate change debate maybe brings up the idea of people not using things as much as they should. And maybe we should go back to the way that things were in the Second World War with food shortages and how the government brought in measures to prevent people from using more than they should, rationing, etc. Do you think the Australian government is likely to go that way with climate change, or is that a bit far down the road? Any of the panel can answer.
Yeah.
Well, obviously the climate change issue isn't going to be solved overnight, and it has to come from us as individuals, but it also has to come from the top down. It's got to come from national and international level policy. And I don't think anyone expects that they're going to take away our cars and make sure that we turn our lights off by 8 o'clock at night. But there are definite concrete ways that we can reduce emissions and not necessarily make huge sacrifices in our lives. And that's going to come through as we turn towards more renewable energy sources. And I think that really is a key. So you've got that innovation and you need the policy.
There are also things you can do with every dollar you spend, making sure that you buy more energy efficient things, more long-lasting things. You can invest in sustainable investments. There's a lot of stuff that you can be doing short of spending $900 on a plasma TV, which I think was a bit of an encouragement earlier on this year. Yep.
I'm not sure who to direct it to, but I just wondered if we're talking about temperature increase doing the damage on the reef, but we're expecting a sea level rise of a metre or so by the end of the century. Is the rising sea level also a major ecological impact on the way reefs will develop, the fact that they'll be deeper in the ocean?
It's a matter of fact that it's interesting. It's a very good question because sea level often gets left behind in the debates about climate change because the effects of temperature and ocean acidification are so immediate for corals and coral reefs. And there's some very interesting work going on now that's showing that the ice caps in for example, Greenland and the West Antarctic ice sheet, there's evidence that these have collapsed in the geological past. And when they have, they've done so quite quickly. And by quite quickly, we mean over 100 years or so. And with quite dramatic consequences, not just a metre, but 6, 8, 10 metres of sea level rise. So this is the dirty little secret in the corner that's we're just now, I think, beginning to uncover and appreciate. So when we think about climate change, we really need to think about the disruption that kind of sea level change could cause, not just for island countries who are, might have a metre of clearance between their land and the sea, but also for countries like ours that depend on the sea and the seaways and the coastal communities for our infrastructure and existence.
There's a question down there, Jenny.
So almost all of the CO2 curves that we see presented in graphs about climate change go back about 600 or 700,000 years. But of course, scleractinian coral reefs have been around for a lot longer than that. So what happens if you extend the CO2 curve all the way back? And what does it mean? Sorry, this question is probably
Luckily, we've got a paleontologist on the panel.
Mainly for John.
Yeah.
I've talked a lot about this in various scientific forums. It's something that nags me and plagues me. Not just media stars, but 350 million years ago, CO2 levels were not at 280 or 350. They weren't at 500. They weren't at 1,000. They were at 6,000. They were 20 times higher than what they are today. During that time, there was lots of sea life on the seafloor. There was reefs that were built. There were other kinds of corals living. We don't have evidence about the rates of change during those times. And therefore, the things that we're experiencing today appear to have the flavor of being dramatically faster rates of change than what we've seen in the past. So when we think about consequences of climate change, we not only have to think about magnitudes, but we also have to think about rates. So my answer to that question is that is that there's a lot of unknowns right now about acidification and its effect on marine organisms. And we really need to know very, very soon about how those rate changes are going to affect organisms, especially organisms who secrete skeletons made of calcite.
No. Sorry, no supplementary question. Was that a comment? Even less chance. No comments. Sorry. Does anyone else have a question? We do have time for one more question. Yeah. No, it's nothing personal. It's just you got to spread it around.
My question is for any of the panel. So we're all pretty convinced here that CO2 is the main driver of climate change. What do you say to senators like, I think it's Steve Fielding, who for some reason aren't convinced by CO2? So what do you say to them who aren't convinced?
Election day is March 2000. Scientists love political questions in this country. Yeah.
I guess my answer would be talk to a scientist.
I think that's excellent. Okay, I think that's a great answer. We do have time for one more question. Oh, sorry, I was going to give it to you, but this other guy, Freshie.
This might be for Professor Hughes, but for any of the panel, considering that Australia is the one nation that's truly, I guess you would call it, or formerly call it a first world, but now an industrialized country, and we have a responsibility to preserving coral reefs in other countries, what would you say, should someone say it's the responsibility of the industrialized countries to subsidize the development of economies of third world countries to help those countries have a better life? And on the converse, how would you prevent those people from having a better life, or when they do have a better life, from acting the way we currently do and preserving the coral reefs or making them better in the future?
Scientists?
We need an economist.
Yeah.
So I'll give you a non-economist answer. I don't think anyone can seriously suggest that people in developing nations have any less right to develop and increase their personal well-being and wealth the way that developed nations have. But I would go back to Morgan's response about issues like efficiencies, and certainly the developing world has a role to play in transfer of technologies that could be so much better employed in Australia, things like solar power and alternative energy sources. We are seeing increasingly development aid from wealthy nations being targeted at issues related to natural resource management and sustainability. So a good example of that is the so-called Coral Triangle Initiative, which is an initiative of the 6 countries to the north of Australia, which is the main coral reef biodiversity hotspot. And those 6 nations, led by Indonesia, with support from Australia, the United States, and the BINGOs, the big conservation NGOs, are now embarking on a really ambitious long-term initiative aimed at building food security and sustaining reefs so that various development options in those countries can be maintained. So I see that as a very positive development.
And unfortunately, that's all we've got time for in the formal part of the public forum. But you will have an opportunity, because all of our speakers are going to hang around for 10 or 15 minutes outside. So if you had a question you didn't get to ask, please make sure you pigeonhole them or collar them or whatever outside. Now, you guys have just got one final job, which is to choose the best of those questions for the bottle of wine prize. Yeah, I know. The microphone's alive. Yeah. Bit of that, yeah, away from the microphone.
It's unanimous. It's the sea level rise question.
Oh, fantastic. Now, please, I want you to walk over to that with that to Jenny, and she'll make sure you get something to fill it with. Thank you very much. for that question. And would you please... Sorry.
My son works for Terry.
Oh, it's a bloody Dorothy Dixer. Rapper? Yeah. Will we ever get genuine members of the public at these things? It's incredible. Please join me in thanking our panellists from left to right, Professor Terry Hughes, Morgan Pratchett, Ali Green, Gary Russ and John Pandolfi. And congratulations to the Centre for putting on a public forum at the end of their jam-packed symposium and for giving us all the opportunity to hear from these speakers. So enjoy the rest of your evening. You can still catch Sideshow Alley if you're quick. And thank you very much for your company this evening. We'll see you again. Cheers.